Welcome to the Tyler's Place podcast, the official podcast of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jurisdiction. I am your host, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and today's guest is a guest that we've had on quite a few times before, and YouTube videos and the like. It is Brother Chris Ruli, 32nd degree KCCH, and recently released, within the last couple of months I should say, is his book, The White House and the Freemasons, which yours truly, myself, just finished the audiobook. We finished it up just a little bit before Christmas. For your listening and educational pleasure, I'll have links to both in the notes for this podcast. But today we're discussing, a lot of times it seems as though, and for all the right reasons as I say in this podcast, that Albert Pike hung the Masonic moon. But there were certainly other sovereign grand commanders of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction who made, if not an equal or possibly larger impact. A lot of this information is obviously of a historic nature, and some of it is certainly of a subjective nature with some of the questions that I asked Brother Ruli in the podcast. So, without taking any further of your time, sit back, enjoy this conversation with Brother Chris Ruli. Who's your special guest, Chris?
My special guest is my infant son, who I'm holding right now because he won't go to sleep.
Awesome. How old is he now?
He is 1 month old. Can you believe it? Yeah.
Technically, I don't think he was supposed to be even that old. He was a little early, wasn't he?
That's right. He was. He was a little early, but just a couple of weeks. But he's doing great, and he can sleep through a hurricane. So I don't mind holding him right now because he is just happy to be here, happy to sleep on me.
Nothing wrong with that.
That's right.
So we've talked a little bit about our topic that we're going to tackle today, and it's one of those topics that, for all intents and purposes, I can understand why people might feel this way. Most of what you hear as far as sovereign grand commanders throughout the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction is Albert Pike, Albert Pike, right. Albert Pike. You could almost go Marsha to that. And for all the right reasons, everything that he wrote, all the history, you name it. But what I wanted to learn a little bit more about were some lesser known sovereign grand commanders that made an impact. But if you could pick 3 or 4 lesser known SGCs and what their accomplishments were, who would you pick?
Well, it's funny because when we focus on Pike, you're right. We focus on Pike. We focus on. I would say actually, John Henry Cowles. Not a lot of people know about him. They know of him. I would argue that they know a little bit more about him than some of the like Batchelor, who a couple of these grandmasters really just had a couple years and then they died, and so we had to move in. The caveat that you provided, which was grand commanders who actually did really good or made significant contributions. I would argue with you and say that there are 2 major ones that you would think, okay, these are the guys that really made significant contributions, who are lesser known. That's the caveat, lesser known. James D. Richardson is number 1.
Okay.
He was born in Rutherford, Kentucky, Tennessee. He was a Tennessee Mason, grew up, got into politics, came to the District of Columbia. Actually, he was serving as a member of the House of Representatives for, I want to say 20 years. And so he was very active in the Scottish Rite, very active in Congress, and we can talk a little bit about more of what his contributions were for the Supreme Council. The second one is one of my personal favorites, not because he was, he's another Southern boy who's from Alabama, George Fleming Moore, and he succeeded Richardson. And he was another prominent Grand Commander, and I think he was a unique Grand Commander in terms of his contributions, and we can talk a little bit about that a little later. So James D. Richardson and George Moore. John Henry Cowles follows after Moore, and Cowles is another one of these individuals. Again, I don't think a lot of people know about him. They may know about some of his contributions. They may know, he served as the Grand Commander. Before that, he was a Secretary General. But really, what were his contributions? And we could talk about him as well. So those 3, I think, are significant. they're not the Albert Pikes. They're not
Right.
the guys. They're not the guys that where if you go to a Supreme Council, excuse me, not a Supreme Council. Well, maybe a Supreme Council. You go to a Scottish Rite meeting and ask, "Hey, who's a Grand Commander that you know?" They may give you the more recent Grand Commanders. They may say Albert Pike. Maybe they'll say like Moses Holbrook, one of the original, early
Oh, wow.
Sovereign Grand Commanders. Who actually Holbrook was the Grand Commander during the anti-Masonic period. So imagine
He
having
got
to
a lot on his plate.
imagine with that. That's right.
Yeah.
So I'll pause there and see where you'd like to take us next.
Probably, or you could, not so much me, but we could probably go on for hours with
Yeah,
this. But let's stick with for the first three that you mentioned.
fine.
And if you could go through maybe, let's say, no more than two or three accomplishments of the three that you mentioned,
Yeah.
and what they did.
Let's go back to James D. Richardson. Born 1843, so before the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
1873, when he's only 30 years old, is elected to state senator. He's a state senator at 30 years old, back in Tennessee.
Right.
1884, he's elected to the House of Representatives, comes to the District of Columbia because he's serving now at the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
Serves there for 20 years. Ends his term in I think it was 1804. I have to confirm that. And he ends as minority leader of the Democrats.
Okay.
And he is pitched and as he was a very one of my favorite stories about James D. Richardson is the District of Columbia, the Masons in the District of Columbia were planning this huge event, and there was a zoning issue. They had this big fair that they created, a fundraiser fair at this big convention center.
Mm-hmm.
They put in too many lights in the convention center. And so they literally, because the District of Columbia's authority is based off of Congress, there's no local government. It's the Congress that basically manages the District of Columbia's legal affairs.
Right.
They ran to James D. Richardson and got a bill passed to increase the height or to increase the number of lights that they could have at this convention center because it was not technically safe. But Richardson passed a bill very quickly within the day to get zoning laws permitted to allow the Masons to have this big event in the District of Columbia. That was the power and the prominence that he had in local government or in national government, excuse me. Now, he becomes a Scottish Rite Mason sometime around 1881. He gets the 4 to the 32nd degree. Albert Pike, in fact, even helps confer some of those, the latter parts of those degrees in 1881. In 1885, here's the craziness. Within a couple months in 1885 and 1884 and 1885,
Mm-hmm.
the 3 years after he becomes a 32nd degree, in 1884 and 1885, within a couple months, he gets a KCCH, he becomes a 33rd degree, and he becomes elected an active member of the Supreme Council within a couple months.
Wow.
That's before the rules got set up where there's a certain time frame associated. 1885, he becomes an active member, right? So 1881, he becomes a Scottish Rite Mason. 1885, he gets all those things we talked about. 4 years later, he becomes the Lieutenant Grand Commander. So within a process of 9 years, close to a decade, he goes from becoming a Scottish Rite Mason to serving as a Lieutenant Grand Commander. Now, Thomas H. Caswell, who is one of these short-term Grand Commanders after Pike's death, when he dies in 1900, he comes in and is elected the Grand Commander. So from 1881 to 1900, he's basically he shifts and becomes the Grand Commander of the Supreme Council. He serves in that role for 14 years, for close to 2 decades. During that time, you ask, well, Chris, what are his contributions?
Right.
During that time, he helps facilitate the formation of the New Age magazine, so the organization's official publication. He helps facilitate, which is, I think, one of the most important, he helps facilitate the selling of the original House of the Temple to finance the construction for the House of the Temple that we have now on 16th Street. In fact, we have a great photograph of him breaking ground at the groundbreaking ceremony for the second House of the Temple.
Mm-hmm.
He is the guy that helps facilitate the the sale or the transition, because it's not really a sale. The old building gets given to the DC Scottish Rite.
Right.
DC Scottish Rite sells their building in order to keep the original House of the Temple, and then the money that they had for that goes into the construction of the House of the Temple. And so he is in that process. Now, unfortunately, he does not survive to see the House of the Temple being completely finished and dedicated. That's his successor, George F. Moore.
Right.
The other thing during this time frame that he does is he is in this process of really helping grow the Supreme Council. When Pike, for example, was a Grand Commander, in his writings and in his allocutions and in his work, we see that he mentions that, well, the fraternity, the Scottish Rite fraternity at the time was maybe consisted of about a couple hundred Scottish Rite Masons.
Mm-hmm.
This was when he was Grand Commander. Through the time frame after Pike as well, when we get to Richardson, the fraternity, the Scottish Rite has grown tremendously. I mean, over hundreds of thousands of Scottish Rite Masons growing throughout the country. And so he's part of that initial swelling of Masons. He's the Grand Commander. He's the executive overseeing one of the largest significant increases of the Scottish Rite that has ever seen, exponentially increase the Scottish Rite has ever seen. And so I think, Richardson really is significant for those contributions. Number one, the book. Number two, the New Age magazine, the journal.
Right. Yeah.
This recurring thing, which is just a great, anyway, I'll talk more about that with the next Grand Commander. And then the House of the Temple, and then his overseeing of this massive expansion of Freemasonry to where you see the great benefits of it today. It really is in part to Richardson's work. And he was just an expert politician. He was liked in the political community. He retired with great honors and great remarks, and then he spent the rest of the time focusing on Freemasonry after he was done his political career. So that was James D. Richardson.
Okay.
George F.
I just want to let everybody know there's a pop quiz on this on Monday, so pay attention.
That's right. And as you know, if anyone's listening to my podcast, you'll know that I go on and on and on. So kick in. That was the first Grand Commander.
Right. Take a breath.
So that's right. Take a breath. Son's doing great.
Good.
Everything's great. Hope you're doing well. Would you like to get a coffee break or water before I go on to George F. Moore?
No, we're good.
Great. All right. Awesome. So George F. Moore. What the heck's the deal with George F. Moore? George F. Moore, Talladega, Alabama, born 1848. So just, about 5 years after, or 5 years after James D. Richardson is born. He is a distinct, or not that distinct, excuse me. He is a distant relative to Meriwether Lewis on his father's side. Lewis and Clark.
Okay.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
He was made a Mason in 1873, close to around the time when Richardson's made a Mason. He is made a KCCH at the exact same time when Richardson's made a Mason in 1884. But unlike Richardson, who gets thrown in and becomes Lieutenant Grand Commander, George Moore becomes an active member in 1888. So 4 years after Richardson becomes an active member in the Supreme Council. And George basically follows the line with Richardson. They both agree on a lot of topics. They both, have the same particular interests. Remember, I told you that Richardson was the one that established the New Age magazine.
Right.
Well, guess who he picked to serve as his editor? George Moore. George was a prolific writer, a prolific author, interested in esoteric stuff, interested in a lot of different things. And he created, and what I would argue is one of his greatest contributions. In fact, I think it is his greatest contribution, is the stewardship of the New Age magazine before he becomes Grand Commander. So he becomes Grand Commander, I believe in I want to say, just had it off the top of my head.
Can I interrupt you real quick with a quick question?
Yes.
From my reading of the New Age magazine, which has been more and more since we have another podcast dedicated to it.
Yes.
When was the shift from more of just a standard periodical? Because that's really how it kind of started off, correct?
Correct. Well, no. What do you mean by standard? Tell me what you mean by standard.
There was so much more to it than just masonry, it seems like.
That's right. I would say if you were looking at the original New Age magazine,
Hmm.
the first I want to say 10 years, maybe 15 years, what you'd find that it basically is a National Geographic. Like, it was travel, it was science, it was art, it was music. The first half of the publication, by the way, monthly,
Right.
was writing about articles about science, about faith, about all this other stuff. And then the second half of the book was on Masonry.
Well,
It
see,
was,
that's
yeah,
my question. When did the focus shift more to masonry overall than just say half of the book?
Cowles, when John Henry Cowles comes in.
Okay. Okay.
So let's talk about Moore, because at this time Moore was serving as the editor.
Hmm.
Richardson dies in 1914. Moore steps in as the Grand Commander. And so he now serves as from 1914 all the way until his resignation in 1921. So he has a very brief time frame
Hmm.
serving on the council, but as Grand Commander. But his contribution to the New Age magazine, I think, is one of the most important because he was the original editor. He basically set the standard for what communications and how the Supreme Council will communicate to its members. He was the voice of the Supreme Council. You would think that it would be the Grand Commander, but in
Right.
many ways, no, because he was the editor of the New Age magazine. Scottish Rite Masons knew more about the Supreme Council through Moore than they did through the Grand Commander.
Sure.
He got
Yeah.
it every single month.
Yeah.
They learned about all the important things. Moore had an editorial page in the back of the New Ages. In every single month, he had an interesting article or maybe an interesting perspective that he gave out. So he was really speaking. Now, unfortunately, when he becomes Grand Commander, he can't really take on that role of the editor anymore because he's got dozens of other things to do as
Oh
Grand
yeah.
Commander.
Yeah. Definitely have to pass that on.
So he passes it on to the Secretary General, who is Cowles, who would eventually become his successor as Grand Commander. Now, the other things that Moore did in terms of contributions, he was really the one that married Freemasonry with American politics or Americanism. We have this idea of Americanism about the
Right.
Supreme Council supporting American organizations or supporting American efforts. Really, it was Moore who really trumpeted that. He wanted to go out there and use Freemasonry as a tool to help people solve global problems. And in fact, that's how he pitched it in the New Age. He said, use the tools, use the principles and the things that Freemasonry does, and use that and have that be applied to everyday life, to society. How can we use Freemasonry towards this goal?
Right.
He also expanded and pushed for this idea of international Freemasonry or universal Freemasonry. He wanted, after the First World War, he set up a national Masonic headquarters in France as a way of getting Masons out there into Europe, getting more of a connection between Masons in Europe. And so I think he did a lot from an international perspective. And so, unfortunately, there were other things in play in the Supreme Council. And unfortunately, Supreme Council's active members didn't necessarily like all these shifts, these grand shifts that were happening in the Supreme Council. And so the Supreme Council basically pushed him out. He resigned in 1921. He became a sovereign grand commander emeritus, and he retained much of his activities. Like, they let him do his things that he wanted to do, but they basically, asked him to step aside. He sort of alienated a lot of people by pushing all these Americanism and international and on all the stuff that he was writing in the New Age magazine. So the New Age magazine effectively became a double-edged sword for Moore.
Wow.
Yeah, because by doing so, by being the public, vocal, I would say microphone, you sort of start to alienate others. And
So
so
could
that
you so could you say that the Supreme Council kind of wanted to keep it that, big air quote secret society type of thing?
No, 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 no. It wasn't about the secrecy. It wasn't hiding anything.
Okay.
It was more about, when you are the leader, or if there are leaders of a national organization,
Hmm.
you don't tend to make dramatic shifts. You tend to make small shifts over time.
Right.
Well, Moore didn't see that as necessary. He said, well, let's just do this. Let's go out there and let's establish a headquarters in France. let's write this magazine and let's include lots of non-Masonic stuff to get people interested in other things outside of Freemasonry. Let's talk about international Americanism. Let's show people in the world that Freemasons are good citizens of the world because we use the principles to make good changes. And so I think that really sort of spurred a lot of the traditional old active members of the Supreme Council who said, we should be a fraternity that's focused on ourselves,
Right.
on improving ourselves, on supporting our own communities internally. Let's make the Scottish Rite a better place. And so I think Moore was just super eager to get out there and to get out into the world. And so I think Moore serves as a really good example of sometimes that rubber band gets stretched out too far, and when it's let go, it snaps back very quickly and it might hurt somebody. So
Sure.
I think that's Moore.
Yeah.
Now, Coles, unfortunately, is not a lesser known sovereign grand commander, but he is a grand commander of great prominence. And he was a very important grand commander. And I would argue, even though people know who Cowles is, they may not necessarily know a lot about Coles or Pike, excuse me. They
Right.
know about Pike, but they may not necessarily know about Coles. Sorry.
Which is funny to me, not to interrupt, which is funny to me
Yeah.
because considering the time that he was, in the East, the changes in the world that he saw and led the organization through is mind-boggling.
Monumental. So now George Moore, during his term, completes the House of the Temple.
Right.
But Cowles really comes in and utilizes it as his headquarters. And Cowles really does a lot of work he reorients the Supreme Council under him. He takes out a lot of the, if there are any problem active members, he puts in the members that he wants.
Right.
How do I say that? Okay, here's another way to say this. Take a look at the New Age magazines during his time frame.
Mm-hmm.
He has a Grand Commander's message. Moore doesn't have that. He sticks to just the editorial on the back of the page.
Right.
But Cal says, no, I want an editorial. I want my own message to be front and center when you open up the magazine, and I want my messages to be important. So he'll have master's messages, or Grand Commander's messages, excuse me, on truth, on virtue, on being a good citizen, on these sort of broad, generic things.
Mm-hmm.
He also introduces the Journeyings. It's a recurring series in the New Age where he basically says, here is where I went. Here's who I worked with. Here's who I traveled.
Right.
Here's who I saw during my trips. All these, things that you now see in the transactions or proceedings of the Supreme Council in the bienniums, you'll see those things published there. He made sure that people knew that he was out there doing things. He met with the president. I traveled to Alabama on September 10th to September 12th. I met with so-and-so. We talked about this. I mean, he was very clear about showing everyone where he was, what he was doing, and how great he was trying to do it. So that's a little bit of an ego there's an ego there
Sure.
with Kells. And
well, I think you could say that about any great leader.
That's right.
That wants to assume a position like that. Ego as a word probably gets a bad rap in that regard, but there is that level of it, to that whole thing.
That's right. And the other thing you have to also consider that he tried to advance or to bring, how do I say this? Bring some more dignity to the office of the Grand Commander. He wanted it to be seen as an active role, active individual, active member of the Supreme Council, not just some guy who sits there and does an allocution in the biennium and then just helps. He's not the Grand Commander that stands back and lets the other members of the Supreme Council do the work.
He leads the charge.
Out there, he leads the charge.
Yeah.
And he wanted to make sure, and that's where the ego comes in. He wanted to make sure that where are all these successes coming from? Well, they're coming from me because I was the one that said, here are the 5 projects we're going to do this year, or here are the things we're going to do. And I want to make sure that that I was the one that accomplished those goals. Here's where I traveled. Here's where I've been. Here's what I believe in. Here's my thoughts with the Grand Commander's message. So he was very much involved in refining what the Grand Master, excuse me, I keep saying Grand Master, what the Grand Commander says, what the Grand Commander does, and how the Grand Commander engages with the Supreme Council. And I think that's very important.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the three.
Whew. All right. Let me stop my head from spinning a little bit from all that information. What makes you think that their accomplishments are possibly overlooked? Is it just because of and this is maybe a poor choice of words, but kind of the mystery of someone like Pike? Is it anything to do with that? Or is it just
No, I think it's a function of time. I think just people don't remember, or we don't really communicate these as commonly as we would. It really takes a historian or someone who's interested in this to go back to the New Age magazines, to go back to the proceedings and look at them and go and analyze and understand these people's relationships. We don't necessarily have those. We don't really write about those. We don't really write about the Grand Commanders. We don't really write about the history. And when we do, because the Supreme Council history is so broad, it's so, it's 2 centuries worth of stuff, you have to dilute some of these down, or distill some of these histories into a couple paragraphs, maybe one paragraph. So Richardson's paragraph is he was Lieutenant Grand Commander. He helped, organize the House of the Temple, like that. George Moore would be the same. Oh, he was the editor of the New Age magazine. He really pushed for Americanism and for international Freemasonry. That's it. What would you know outside of that unless you didn't dig in and dive into it?
right?
Now, I think what we're doing here, this podcast, and some other work that you'll see hopefully coming soon, is we're starting to tell more of those stories. We're trying to bring those out again and, clean off the dust off of these old books and talk more about these stories with Masons.
So if you could pick from each of the three that we've gone through today, if you could pick one thing that they did that had the longest lasting effect on Scottish Rite Masonry and possibly the world at large, what would it be from each one of them?
Richardson helped move Scottish Rite Masonry from the 19th century into the 20th century. If that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes a huge amount of sense. There's going to be a shift in so many different things, and not just in the United States, but in the world.
Right. So if I were to say, what did Richardson do? He shifted not just the mindset, not just the physical, but he also changed where the headquarters is. He made it this grand, he pushed to make a grand building commiserate with the organization itself, a growing organization. I think that's Richardson's contribution. Moore's contribution, I think, is more literary. It's more educational. It's more focused on research and talking about Freemasonry. And I think his contribution really is about how does Freemasonry go out into the world and try to solve some of the world's problems using the principles and the lectures and the things that we learn about as Masons.
Right.
Cal's, I think, is a little different. I think it's more about how do you structure an organization so it runs more efficiently, and it has an executive at the top that understands the organization's problems and is willing to actively engage to find solutions to that organization's problems. But it's a top-down approach because he believes there's a lot of issues going on. And if I can just clear some of this red tape and do it myself and get everyone involved, I think we'll be better out. So I think that's Cal's, so how do you engage as the Sovereign Grand Commander?
Right.
More was, how do you use Freemasonry to tackle and solve a nation's problems or a country's problems or a world's problems using Freemasonry? And Richardson is, how do you move from 19th century to the 21st century? How do we bring in technology? How do we bring in buildings? How do we bring in an infrastructure to support a growing Scottish Rite?
I guess the archetype for a lot of things to come.
Sure. And by the way, Pike, what did Pike do? What was his major contribution to Freemasonry? Or excuse me, not just Freemasonry, but the Scottish Rite? I would argue that Pike helped oversee and set up the structure for what Freemasonry is now. He gave you the structure of, here's some education through books.
Right.
Here is some, acknowledgement of your work through the court, the honor and court systems, the courts of honor and, the KCCH and 33rd. He set up these structures to help an organization grow from several hundreds to several thousands. Richardson's was, how do you grow from several thousand Masons to a national, global, international organization?
Right.
And I think those two have different sets of variables. Those are two different strategies. They're two different tools. They're two different toolboxes. And I think that's the Richardson issue.
Now, with all that, to wrap up with the last question.
Yes.
Do you have one in particular that you feel has had the greater and longer lasting impact over what the others contributed?
In my mind, I sort of go between Cowles and Richardson.
I can see where it would be a tough decision to make.
Yeah. Now I'm biased.
Sure.
I dive into the histories. I read all these people's writings. So I think Richardson might today be the person I say. I think Richardson set up, based on just these three people alone, I think Richardson was the more impactful Grand Commander. To answer your question, I think he's the person that I would select. But on another day and another time, I may say Cowles, I may say Moore. I'm not really sure. It depends on the time frame, or depends on the mood I'm in, or maybe the things that I'm thinking about that are more important.
It's beyond an openly subjective argument for any of them.
Yeah, it's sort of, I know this is not appropriate at all, but it's sort of like listing your favorite movies. You may have the top movie, or maybe you'll say, I don't know which one's best, but here are my top three.
Right.
And so I think definitely Richardson is absolutely on my top three. Moore maybe on my top three if I'm feeling like we should be doing great things out in the community. Moore might be there.
Right.
Cal's different story.
So at the end of the day, you could almost say, I can't answer that.
Today for the purpose of this podcast, I'll go with Richardson.
Okay, perfect.
I like James D. Richardson. I think he did a lot of great work, and I think he set the fraternity, or the Scottish Rite fraternity, on a path to where we are today.
Once again, a big, huge thanks to Brother Chris Ruli and his special guest for being exceptionally well-behaved. On today's podcast, the Tyler's Place podcast is brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. If you're interested in learning more about Freemasonry, go to scottishrite.org/beafreemason. Check out our homepage at scottishrite.org, our Facebook page, facebook.com/Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment for this interview. Once again, my name is Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason. We'll see you again next time here on the Tyler's Place.